Thank you very much. Okay, sharing the screen. I hope that is up. There we go. As Rick said, if you have a quick question, put it in chat and Mary Eliza will break in for longer questions or for discussion or point counterpoint. Please save it to the end. If you will note in the lower right-hand corner, there is a page number. And so if you have a question or a point on a specific page, just we can go by that. The entire PowerPoint will be up on the Livable California website, and it includes in the note pages the full sites and links. And then, as always, contact me if you have any questions. Okay, we're going to cover a large number of topics, and this is not going to be in any particular order because a lot of it is all mixed up. So we're going to be covering a lot of the stuff you have on your screen there. This is a very complex topic. Even if I take the entire 2 hours, which I won't, we couldn't possibly even get into all of the topics, let alone get into any very deeply. Also, I have to admit, there is a huge amount of information out there. And like in many things, if you want to bad enough and you want to prove a point, you can always find somebody out there who you can cite as agreeing with and supporting your point, no matter how silly it might be. We're going to have to start with a review of basic 8th grade science. So there are many, many forms of energy. And there I've listed about 8 of them that are pertinent for what we are going to do today. And energy is constantly being transformed from one of these forms to the other, or within each form to a different subform. And like everything else, energy has 3 elements of utility: form, place, and time. And my example is, if you want to turn on the lights in your home through electricity, it must be in the form of 120 volt alternating current. It must be available in your house. Doesn't do any good if it's 3 blocks down the street or 2 states over. And it must be there when you want to see. So there are the 3 forms, and that's very important, getting energy into the right form for humans and others to use. Generation of energy always has unintended and sometimes very negative consequences, such as air, water, noise, light, and other types of pollution. And finally, to get the energy you want, where, when, in the right form, there is often a very, very large loss along the way. A lot of the energy just doesn't go towards the objective you'd really like it to. Now, this is energy, total energy generation in the US over the last 30 years or so by fuel. And as you can see, it's been fairly constant overall. But coal down here at the bottom, coal is in the middle, has been going way, way down. And to a large extent, it's being replaced by natural gas at the bottom. This is driven to a large degree by fracking, which made natural gas both far more abundant, and the U.S. is leading producer of natural gas now, and the cost went way down, though it's gone up and down over time. Renewables, which are shown in green, you can figure that out, have also been increasing, but they're still a lot smaller than either of these. Petroleum, which is now mainly for transportation also for heating and for power in some cases, but still mainly for transportation. It's been relatively constant. And frankly, the other stuff is kind of lost in the rounding. Now, you'll see a lot of these as we go through. I'm not going to spend any time on that because that was my speaking notes. So I'll stay on the actual chart. Now, here's the worldwide electric coal. And you can see it's still going up. What's happening here is that the developed nations, led by the U.S., have been phasing out coal for electricity for some time, and it hasn't been widely used for heat in the U.S. for even longer. But in much of the world, particularly the developing world, and for this purpose, I'm going to include China and India there, which are the two largest nations by population, it is still going up. And these populations in the developing world are very hungry for the advantages of higher development that the initial developed nations have achieved. And now these advantages are very well known to the people in the less developed nations through the first wave of technology that's hit them, which has been smartphones, where you can get a tremendous amount of information, through the internet, which is also out there in many even very, very undeveloped nations. And so they're knowledgeable of this. Then we are going to see rapid industrialization improvement in human well-being in the less developed nations. It's been going on, frankly, for quite a while. The worldwide poverty has been dropping constantly. But that needs electricity, particularly reliable electricity. And for the leaders of these less developed nations and developing nations, they understand that keeping their people happy is very important to the future success of their nations and their own persons. And coal is one of the fastest and easiest ways to add major generating capacity. By the way, up at the very end here, there's a reduction. That's due more to COVID than anything else. Now, the real problem we have along the way, as I mentioned, is the elimination of global poverty. And so we are going to see these communities demanding more electric power and more motorized mobility. The motorized will be more fuel in the form of for internal combustion engines, because the electric vehicles will probably take a lot longer to go in there for a variety of reasons. Chief among them, they're more expensive. And if the infrastructure to distribute electricity doesn't exist, the infrastructure to charge vehicles will even be more trailing. Here's some things about California, and obviously we're in California, so I'm going to spend a time on that. Obviously, the largest population, about 10% of the national population, a little bit more than that, in fact. And we use about 1/10 of the national motor gasoline consumption and about 1/7 of the jet fuel consumption, because our populace tends to travel quite a bit. In-state, our energy use, as you can see, transportation is about 1/3 of our total energy use. Industrial is about 1/4, though that's been sinking because a lot of our industry is going down. We aren't manufacturing as much here as we used to. And residential and commercial are that. And industrial includes agricultural for this definition. And that's all, if you add it up, it's almost the total. But interestingly enough, our per capita consumption is less than any other state except Hawaii. And part of that is due to our climate. And again, the entire PowerPoint will be available site for those that are interested. So we have been trying here very, very hard for years, decades, to be the leaders in cleaning up the air and everything else, etc. But it is a slow and expensive process, and there's a lot of resistance. Now, here are the most recently available energy consumption estimates. And as you can see, coal is very small. We've just about phased it out. We didn't have that much to begin with. Natural gas was large and has been growing in recent, particularly over the last 2 decades. And you can go on from there and see how the others rank. And the renewables we haven't been doing as well as we would like. Now, one thing to pay attention to, net interstate flow of electricity, and I've got another graph chart going up that will talk about that. Now, again, this is for energy. This does not count using petroleum or natural gas in industry for its chemical properties. So again, we were never a huge user of coal. By replacing it with natural gas, we have substantially reduced emissions. Natural gas is much cleaner than coal, particularly for non-greenhouse gas emissions, because petroleum and natural gas in particular, they're both hydrocarbons, but the fluids, particularly natural gas, have far less carbon and more hydrogen. So natural gas in particular only has about half of the carbon of coal. So if you're trying to reduce greenhouse emissions, as well as a lot of other emissions, natural gas is a significant improvement. It's not all the way there, but it's a great improvement. The state is very unhappy with nuclear and trying to get rid of it. Due to the various current emergencies, we have been putting off shutting down the last remaining active power plant in Diablo Canyon. Also, we are not expanding hydroelectric generation. We are not building any new dams. We're actually tearing out more dams, or planning to tear out more dams than we were even talking about putting in, which is nothing. And that's also what's going on nationally. There is some growth in hydroelectric power as the newer turbines are more productive. And so to some extent, existing hydro dams are seeing increased energy output because they have more productive generation capacity through new technology. But in order to have hydropower, you need water. And I don't need to say much more about that. Okay. Now, here is how we fare next to the most important other states. There are 3 interties in the U.S., the Western, the Eastern, and Texas, which is all by itself. And the borders do not fall cleanly on the state borders. But there are basically 11 states that make up the vast majority of the Western intertie. Now, also in there is British Columbia, Alberta, some parts of some other states, and northern Baja California. But for our purposes, the total generation and the total consumption on this map pretty much match. There's a slight overage of consumption, but it's only a couple of percent. Now, what you see here is that California is obviously the big outlier. It's almost exactly 1/3 of our total consumption is taken from these other states, and a little bit from British Columbia. And that's very important, particularly as we talk about our mix. So going on, this next graph shows the sources of electric power in California versus the other 10 states. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of difference. Coal is 20%, over 20% in the rest of the states, and almost nothing here. Natural gas is over half for energy in the US versus about 30%. And that obviously is very significant. So what we're doing to a great extent, we are exporting our electricity emissions of both greenhouse gas and everything else. On nuclear, the other states are a little ahead of us. Hydro, they are far ahead of us, particularly in Oregon and Washington. We get a lot of energy, particularly during the summer, for the peaks from Oregon and Washington, and a little bit from British Columbia. The solar and the wind, California is very big on solar, and we'll get more on that later. Other states are bigger on wind, and there are some advantages and disadvantages, but here in California, we've been emphasizing solar, and that has a lot of implications, and we'll get into it. And we have fairly significant geothermal in California, which the others don't have, and then all else combined, we're a little bit higher. Okay, now getting into renewable energy, we have a lot of issues. The key one for both solar and for wind is they don't work all the time, and you don't know when they will work. Direct solar obviously only works when the sun is shining. Well, in San Francisco, which is a little bit north of the midpoint, you have more than 50% more daylight, and it's more valuable daylight during the summer as you do during the winter. Look at that difference, over 5 hours. Also, to get the most value out of the sun, you want to have your panels, and you want to have the sun coming in at the perpendicular, exactly 50%, and that's ideal. And so if you have fixed solar panels, then there's a curve, classic bell curve, and you get the absolute maximum at local noon, assuming the sun is shining and it's not cloudy. And then it falls off, and then at the extreme morning and evening, just after dawn and before dusk, you get very little of value. This isn't really good because local noon is not the peak load point for electricity. It's generally right about 5, 6 o'clock. And this is particularly in summer when the air conditioning usage is peaking. And so this solar curve for energy is not real good. So you've got the angle of the sun above the horizon, and then also and the lower it is, the less value you have unless you can constantly reposition your panels, which some can do. But for most residential, they are fixed, and that's it. Also, the lower the sun is, the more air it goes through, and that also reduces the heat value. And then, of course, we have weather, mainly clouds. Okay. Now, also, you've got the real estate requirements. If you have large solar farms, you're basically taking up the entire land. But solar can be put in small increments, such as on residential roofs. And you can put them up over parking lots. I'm sure everybody has seen the type of, false, it looks like a false sunshade, and it is a sunshade, but it's not there to keep your car out of the wind or getting hot. It's there to prop up the solar panels. Thermal solar panels, I think most of you have probably heard of them. You have a huge pot of land where you have steerable mirrors that are all directed towards a water vessel piping that is up on a high tower, and it's heating that up to make steam to drive generators, electric generators. Well, that kind of thing can be hazardous to flying creatures, mainly birds. Okay. Now, wind energy has similar problems, but it also has different problems. Wind farms are very noisy, and in some cases create shadows that people don't like. The good news is, if you have something like a farm and you lay out your wind generation properly, you can get dual use out of it. And Iowa, for example, if you've ever driven I-80 across the middle of Iowa, boy, it's wind farm after wind farm, and that is a big source of their energy there. Wind farms also cause bird losses when birds strike the blades. In some extreme cases, there have actually been wind farms with observers with binoculars out there who are constantly looking for birds that are endangered or threatened. And if they appear, they shut down the energy generation. The good news is the birds, many of them appear to be learning to stay away, and they have been also trying technologies that would not draw the birds directly into the blades with some success, but it's still a problem. Okay, the good thing about wind is that you don't need the sun, so you can run in the middle of the night. You don't care if it's cloudy. You don't care what the weather is, unless it's either a dead calm or a tremendous wind. There's a limit on how fast these things will go. So at some point you have to say, no, shut them down. And if it's a dead calm, obviously there's no wind. Solar, as I said, can be implemented small scale, but for wind, not so much. If you're on an individual farm, or if you have an individual plant and you want to put up 1 or 2 turbines, yes, you can do it, but those would tend to be fairly large. But residential scale wind is just not something that we've seen very much of, except in a very, very densely populated area. Also with wind, as a general rule, the larger the device, the higher the output and the higher the return on investment. And so this is one of the main reasons why we've been going to offshore. There's still a lot of animosity about that. We are looking at it fairly strongly now in California, but there's much more now on the East Coast than we have on the West Coast. In the meantime, we have some very significant wind farms in California. Those of you that have driven 580 from the Bay Area to Central Valley, there's a big one there. I-10 east from LA to Phoenix, again, one very large one there. And another one on 238 going up from Bakersfield to the high desert. There's another very large one there. So this is what we're seeing in wind. It's significant here, but it is not as significant as it is in many, many other states, particularly Texas, where it has really, really become an important factor, which is surprising to a lot of people. People think that Texas is oil, and it is, but it's also wind. Now, fortunately, most of the big wind farms are out in unpopulated areas. If something breaks, boy, this can be a very large piece of equipment that's going off and could hit something and cause a lot of damage. Very infrequent, and because it's generally unpopulated, you don't see many personal injuries and not a whole lot of property damage given the property that's installed out there. It's also very complicated and expensive to install. We're talking in many cases for industrial size, each blade is far longer than a semi. So you have to have special semi rigs to get them there over back roads because it doesn't go under overpasses very well. And it's a massive logistical area just to get it there. And then you've got to have large cranes on site to build them after you put in a major base. So what you want to do is have something that's pretty large and you'll be able to get a lot of use out of it. My personal opinion is that wind has a lot of potential, and I think nationally has more potential than solar. But we've seen a lot more emphasis, particularly in California, on solar. And I think a lot of that may be political. Now, one of the biggest problems here is, again, the mix match of when solar and wind are actually putting out electric power and when it's needed. So we get in the storage problem. And it is still very difficult and expensive to store electricity, although things have been getting a lot better very quickly. Everybody knows about batteries, but until very recently, a large-scale battery farm for storage electricity was not really that viable. And we are now pushing past that. And I think we're going to see continued improvements there. And so electricity will become more and more viable. Another problem we have is you want to run your electric grid as constant as you possibly can. You want to have very, very high quality 60 cycle, 120 or 240 or whatever else you have for the industrial and other users that need more power. You want to keep that very, very constant. When you have a large reliance on these renewables, it makes it far more difficult to have the reliability. Germany has had for well over a century a reputation for precision engineering and precision manufacture. And that means you've got to have a grid that is very reliable in production of its energy. Well, Germany went very major into wind, which makes a lot of sense there, particularly since solar in Germany just doesn't have the potential. It's farther north and their weather is not as good as we have it in the US. So wind made a lot of sense. But the variations in energy from wind were causing so much problems that a lot of the major precision German manufacturers were looking to relocate so they weren't constantly shutting down their production lines. And a lot of them wound up going to the American South, where the power is still mainly coal. This is some of the negative feedbacks you get. Then we have our regulatory practices here that have caused issues. For years in California in particular, you could get a lot of really good benefits up front if you signed up for solar on your roof. And either the state, the nation, or individual suppliers would pick up a lot of the cost. Then you would be able to sell back the power you didn't use. And so we were doing net metering. So if you were generating enough electricity to cover your needs, your bill could be a small fraction of what your next door neighbor was. But here's the problem. For most people, that meant they were taking electricity off the grid during the peak hours in the late afternoon and early evening, where their solar wasn't producing much, if anything, and they were selling their solar produced during the middle of the day at high noon, where they were using very little in their home. The problem with that is the electric utilities didn't really have any use for that midday electricity, but they're buying and selling at the same rate. And on top of that, the charge for the use of the distribution system was based on the net. So the utilities were saying we were not getting our fair share of what we need to maintain the distribution net. And so we were shifting a lot of the cost of electric utilities away from solar users, and many people say well below their fair share, to all the other users, the residential users who don't have solar and the industrial, commercial, etc. Now, finally, the state PUC about 2 years ago started to make that change, and this has been a major, major battle. And we'll see how that turns out. Now, we have an underside to climate change mitigation. Now, I am not going to get up here and say that there is no such thing as climate change. I believe that there is. And I believe it's an important issue. And I believe that we have to start working on mitigations decades ago. So we need to do things, we need to do them now. But the downside of this is everybody who's got a project, a program, or a cause is now tying their cause to climate change and say, give us money because it is important for climate change. And we have a huge research industry that is funded by government and NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that are doing climate studies. And to get funded, the smart thing to do is to say, look at how successful these climate change mitigations are. You'll get more grant money, you'll get publicized in referee journals, you'll be invited to the conferences to speak for pay. And if you are saying, well, this isn't working too well, you're probably not going to be quite as favored. I have a t-shirt, I didn't wear it today, but I think most of you have seen it, that says, there's a lot more money to be made by being in favor of cosmically stupid, multi-billion-dollar government-funded programs than being against. That's very true, particularly if you're a researcher who wants to do honest research. And so there are a lot of programs that are being promoted for their climate change benefits that have actual benefits that will be a lot less than claimed in. And some of them, and I'm talking to you, California High-Speed Rail, there's going to be a negative impact. Now, are there basic ways to reduce greenhouse gases that don't involve huge changes in huge capital infrastructure? Yes, there's quite a few. And some of these are very simple that each of us can do. Things as turning the home thermostat up and down, more fuel efficient car, the newer brands of light bulbs, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, all of these are things that all of us can do and to a large extent should do, but they are mainly a matter of better public education. I am not advocating for mandatory state HVAC factors, filter inspections twice a year. This is a very old graph by these standards. This is from McKinsey, December 2007. By the way, all of my citations and links are in the notes on the PowerPoint for those of you that are interested, or you can contact me. Now, what this is the amount and the size of of greenhouse gas emissions that can be done for various strategies. So residential building lightings right here, that is a big, big chunk that can be done. Then what is interesting, if it's in gray, that means the cost is under $50 per ton of greenhouse gas emissions, which means $50 per ton of carbon dioxide. It's how it's measured. Now, the vertical, this is how much it will cost. So out here on coal power plants and doing total rebuilds for carbon capture, it can be done, but it's very, very expensive. And so do we really want to bother, even if it's under $50 a ton? There's a lot of them that cost a lot less. New nuclear, for example. And by the way, this is 2007, and the cost has gone down on a lot of these. The ones where it's on the bottom, that means no subsidy is required. If the users do it, they will have a cost savings. So if you are going to do, for example, fuel economy packages on cars, that will cost something, but over its lifetime, you will save money. So we have a lot of those going on. This is a more recent one, and I've got 3 or 4 graphs here from NEED, and I've got a cite to their links. And again, here, if you see it in blue, that means that it's cost effective without any subsidy at all. Just do it because it's a good idea and you'll save money as well as cleaning up. And again, we have solar and wind energy here. At some point, it becomes less cost effective. And you'd be putting in money and you'd never get your capital investment back. They're also saying that bioelectricity, you will pay more for it. And we're finding that's true in a lot of cases, et cetera, et cetera. And I won't go over all of these. By the way, just for reference, this is the 4 gigaton a year line, and the total current world energy output of greenhouse gas emission is about in the low 30s. So this is how significant a lot of these can be. Okay, now here are the sources by nation and by geography. And for the early period, up through about 1950, the U.S. was half of the total. The U.S. is still growing, but everybody else is taking off. The UK, other developed nations obviously have been growing. Russia was growing and then has been sinking. But here's the big deal. China really taking off like crazy. And much of that is in the form of coal. Then India also recently, also heavily coal. And then the rest of the world. And this is what I was talking about the developing world wanting to develop. They need electricity, and they are going to go for whatever is the easiest and cheapest. And in many cases, that's coal. Okay, here's electrical, U.S. net electrical generation by fuel, and looking forward. And this is from U.S. Energy Information Administration. A lot of my data is from there. And you can see here that solar and wind, by all of these scenarios, are projected to grow. And they are also showing solar being more significant. I really wonder about that. I don't know enough about the details. But from the research I personally have done, I see a lot of advantages to wind over solar, particularly as it's coupled with energy storage, which is becoming more and more viable, literally every month. We see coal continuing to decline. That's the gray here. Natural gas is still under the, before we did things, it was still slowly growing. In the later ones, natural gas is going down as the clean, mainly solar and wind, not only cover all of the increase, but they eat into some of the natural gas and even more of the coal. But what I don't see, and this is also of concern, is nuclear is still not going very, very far in the US. And there's a lot of interesting things going in to nuclear. Okay. My personal feeling is we should adopt perfection is the enemy of good enough. We need, before we go into the feel good, into the easy answer, solar is wonderful, we need to do more solar. Let's take another look. Well, California high-speed rail will save greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah, let's take another look. It was wrong when it came out the first time, and now it's absolutely impossible for that ever to happen. So we need to have more independence and less influence of those who are selling a product that is not greenhouse gas emissions. We should try to get statutes and regulations requiring outcomes, not methods, and not technology, but results. And we've got to figure out how we can change our basic government decision-making process. All I'm going to say here is we need to figure it out. I have no idea how to do it. Okay. Finally, when we see something that was supposed to work and isn't producing, we have got to take a look and we've got to be willing to cut it off. And again, California high-speed rail. Now, let's look at where we're going in transportation. So we have ICE, internal combustion engines, which this state has already moved to stop of new ones after the cutoff, I believe 2035. And other states and the federal government are seriously considering that. Some are pretty far along in that. So where we want to have is zero emission vehicles, ZEVs, and there's mainly two types of those, battery electric vehicles, and then hydrogen fuel cell. And we're going to talk about both of these. And then we have plug-in hybrid electric, which are seen as a transitional improvement, but will eventually have to be phased out in favor of pure zero emission vehicles. And we're doing the same thing with medium and heavy duty trucks, mainly semis and larger box trucks, which are not by definition light duty vehicles, and also passenger buses. These take a lot longer because the technology just isn't there yet. These need to have longer ranges. Now, Toyota, for more than a decade, Toyota is either the largest or second largest auto manufacturer every year for the past decade. It has been strongly advocating for our battery electric vehicles. But let's look at what it's now saying. This is from a Toyota document. Specifically, it's from a document it sent out to its franchisees to explain what they're doing and why. And there are their commitments, and they are not backing off from these commitments. These first three are direct quotes from Toyota, and they are still being, that's their commitment. But this is me talking. They aren't backing off, but they're saying these are going to be difficult to overcome. Again, these are directly from Toyota. Critical barriers, three major barriers to widespread battery electric. Critical materials. we need 300 new mines, and they just are not there. Without those new mines to produce these materials, batteries cannot be made from current technologies. There are more new battery technologies being invented every day, but getting them to the point where they're ready for prime time is going to take a while. And some of them are going to be dead ends. So we have an imbalance between the raw materials and the final product. Charging infrastructure. Most public chargers are not fast. And only about 12% are currently fast chargers, which means you can get to 80% in 20 to 60 minutes. And there are just not enough chargers, period, out there. So there's a huge requirement to get more chargers out there, or people will not be able to charge their vehicles, which means they will not be able to use them. So this is one of the biggest, if not the single biggest problem right now. The other problem that is not mentioned here is battery electric is range limited. So with a 300-mile range, if you're driving around your city, your region, you probably do not have any problem at all. And you can recharge at home overnight, particularly if you've got a fast charger. But if you're driving to Omaha, which I do once or twice a year, doesn't work, even with fast charging. And then finally, we have the affordability, where Toyota, and this is a current document, is saying that it's a $10,000 price hike for battery electric. You may get that back over time in lower fuel costs, lower cost electricity, but that's still $10,000 up front, and the subsidies are being phased out. And then you also need a home charger, and this is for a slow speed charger, $1,300. So, and again, this slide is taken directly from Toyota. They've come up with the 1-6-90 rule, and they say the raw materials for one long-range battery electric vehicle could instead be used to make 6 plug-in hybrids or 90 pure hybrids, not plug-in. The reason is, here you need a small battery because it's constantly being recharged. And when the electricity is gone, it'll just run on the internal combustion engine. Here, you got to plug it in. You got to get a pretty full charge. You don't need a huge, quite as big a charge, but it has to be bigger. Again, you can fall back on your internal combustion engine, but the whole idea is to have a bigger engine, a bigger battery, so you can go a lot more without having to burn gas or what else. And this, of course, has to be all electric, all battery. Here's the key thing. The overall carbon reduction of these 90 hybrids over their lifetimes is 37 times as much as a single electric battery vehicle. Keep that in mind. I'm going to show you why that's important. Okay. Now, then we have the impact on the electric grid. And it is, I've done a lot of research on this. This is not my area of specialty. It goes all over the place. Everything from double to no more than the more usual growth rates that we've been experiencing. The electric grid, which means both the power generation and the long distance transmission, and going right down to the home. Because if you're going to be charging, doing rapid charging of your car at home, the electric grid in your neighborhood may not be up to it. And this could be very expensive. There's one estimate here that through 2030, with 40 million EVs on the road, it could be 200 million. And that could go up if it's all electric vehicles on the road. Multiply that by 10. But we also have people here that are representative of recognized institutions that are saying, oh, this is no big deal. Okay, so all I can say on that is it's too early to be able to tell. But California already has a problem. I don't need to remind most of you of what happened when the legislature decided that it knew how to run an electric grid more than the people who had been doing it for years. Who can trust those public utilities? And we had huge problems. And we had price spikes like we wouldn't believe, as the Wall Street game players and others were playing the system to take it to us. And the same type of mistakes are still being made. We have very, very expensive electricity here. And the main reason is two main reasons. One, we're going green. Green electricity is more expensive. And two, we don't run what we have very well. Now we get into a crucial problem for zero electric vehicles: upstream emissions. This means if you look at a battery electric or a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, what are the tailpipe emissions? Tailpipe emissions doesn't even have a tailpipe. It's zero. When it runs, there are no emissions. But where did we get the power to charge the batteries and to create the hydrogen fuel? And the answer is this takes a hell of a lot of energy. These, in some cases, they're small, but they are not inconsequential, even in the best case. This, I went to EPA, and they have a nice little tool, and I ran two examples. This is a pretty good, efficient, all-electric vehicle. And I said, what is the impact in San Francisco, which has some of the cleanest energy in the US? And here, the average new gasoline vehicle, the dark blue, has substantial. And then there is energy offline to produce the total energy of 410 for the average new gasoline vehicle. But in San Francisco, there is still an impact. So 90 to 410, that's the impact. So it's a little less than 25% of the impact, even in San Francisco. Okay, but here I went to a larger plug hybrid, and I went to the place with the dirtiest in the terms of greenhouse emissions in the US, which is Hawaii, which has primarily oil electric generation, and the second biggest is coal. Here, the total emissions for this vehicle are actually more than the average new vehicle. But even in the best case, this is still significant. And that's the US average, 140 to 410. That's more than a third. Okay. Now, this is something, if anybody has actually heard of this, let me know. Say something in chat. This is the proposed EPA emission standards, the multi-pollutant emission standard for 2027 and later light-duty and medium-duty vehicles. And this is currently out there as a proposed rule. And read what I have in yellow. The requirement for upstream emissions accounting for battery electric and plug hybrid electric vehicles would be removed. In other words, the EPA is saying that in official government statistics and government decisions for battery electric versus other technologies, it will be considered that there are no upstream emissions in electricity generation. This is just wrong. It is stupid, and it will lead to some very, very bad decisions that will cost us a lot of money and will not produce the greenhouse gas emissions that are being promised. Okay. Now, here's another one. We'll go, I'm getting close to the end, but let's have some fun with this. We have many cities across the nation, starting with Berkeley and spreading fastest in California, but also others across the nation. Even the nation is looking at. We're going to cut off natural gas electricity for residences. Okay, and let's see how it works. Now, here's the old style. This is fairly simple. The natural gas goes to a natural gas heater, water heater. You burn the natural gas to heat the water to 115 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. That's it. Pretty simple. An energy transfer from chemical to heat and from heat to heat the water. Now, the alternative is a little bit more complicated. And since natural gas is still the highest used for electric generation, we start with burning natural gas. Then we superheat the steam, not to 140 or even 212. Superheated steam means it's heated under pressure. So it will get up to a lot more energy, which is translated into motion to drive a generator, which is then makes the motion into electricity, which goes over long lines. And then generally along the way, it gets ramped up to higher voltages. It gets converted in many cases between AC and DC and back and forth. Then it goes back down, and then it reaches your local utility, and it's ramped back down. And then it goes to a neighborhood pole where it's finally ramped down generally to 120 volt, where it then goes to an electric water heater to heat the water to 115 to 140 degrees. Quite a few transformations along the way. And every time you have a transformation, you lose energy. It's just the nature of the beast. It's basic physics, laws of entropy, etc. This is not saving energy, and it is creating more greenhouse gases. And one other thing I forgot is electric distribution. You have what we call line loss. Unless you have supercooled superconductors, you're going to be losing 4, 6, 8% of the power when you transmit it several hundred miles. Just the nature of the beast, you cannot escape it. Okay, now I'm going to spend a little bit of time on hydrogen fuel cells. Basically, you are oxidizing hydrogen, H2, the fuel cell to create electricity. This is not internal combustion. They're oxidizing it, but they aren't burning it in the sense of an internal combustion engine. It's still burning it. Oxidation is burning, even if you're doing it with iron to create rust. So the emissions here is water vapor and almost nothing else. So you're putting water vapor in the air. Water vapor has a very minor greenhouse gas impact, and they're still arguing whether it's positive or negative. Most people think it's slightly negative. But here's what happens. You're creating your H2. So you're starting with you're starting with methane, which is CH4, and you're mixing it most commonly in this hydrogen color rainbow. You have all of these different technologies, and I'm going to go over these. But the purest one is green, which means we're going to set up most typically solar or wind to split water into hydrogen and water. So the only outputs are hydrogen and water. The oxygen goes back in the air. We capture the H2 and we use that as fuel. No greenhouse gas emissions if you do it. The most common one today is gray. And that's about half. And that's made by taking methane, which is the main component, natural gas, and water. You superheat it, and you in the presence of a catalyst, the CH4 and the H2O, the atoms separate. If there's a chemistry teacher out there, I apologize. And what you're left with is the H2 gets together. The hydrogen forms H2. And you're left with C's and O's. And they get together and they form carbon dioxide, which is the greenhouse gas you were trying to avoid. Okay. Now, if you have a capture of the CO2, then you are making blue hydrogen. And you don't allow it to escape. And so good, that's good for the greenhouse gas, but then you have to do something with the CO2. But if you don't capture it and you release the CO2 in the air, for every ton of hydrogen fuel, you create 10 tons of carbon dioxide. Now that sounds really bad. It says you're creating more GHG than you are fuel, and in terms of weight, you are. But compared to a conventional diesel engine and transit bus, that's still reducing the greenhouse gases by 60%. And also, diesel power plants have other emissions, everything from carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, oxides of nitrogen, ozone, and large and small particle emissions. So there are some problems with zero emission buses and other vehicles. And they are also one hell of a lot more expensive. And right now, electric vehicles, electric heavy duty vehicles are more expensive. Electric buses are like double the price of natural gas buses. And fuel cell buses are even more expensive. So this is what we're dealing with. These are some of the things you need to be aware of. And if you just go to a presentation on here's what we're planning to do, a lot of this will never come up. Okay, so finally, my conclusions. We live in the time in history where we're seeing the fastest new technologies. And not only that, the rate of technology change is increasing constantly. There are more things coming up every day. It is more than anybody can even begin to deal with. We have a major problem of climate change and other human-caused environmental issues. We have to address them now and address them hard. But before we start saying, here's what we're going to do, we have to make sure that what is being promoted actually works. And moreover, that it's the best option. And unfortunately, as I think I've demonstrated with just a few examples, there are many, many cases where we are being sold a bill of goods for the benefit of a small number of special interests. So all I can recommend is stay on top of things, watch out, be careful, trust your gut, do your own research. Don't be at all reluctant to ask questions and demand backup. Look for unbiased experts without any skin in the game. Feel free to contact me at any time. Okay, I'm done, ready for questions. If somebody has a question that refers to a graph, let me know, and I will go back and get it.